Hey, it's Mazzy. Welcome back to It's the Music Stupid, another episode of albums I gathered together from my collection to showcase to you. I'm concentrating this time on the worst band in the world and subsequent splinter projects and how they were created a little bit. This is not a deep dive into the worst band in the world, but it's just a little bit of a taste. At some point, maybe I'll go all in. It's just one of my favorite bands, and that is 10cc. This is their second album, and the reason I'm saying it's the worst band in the world, because that's literally the second song on their second album, a song called The Worst Band in the World. From Manchester, England, one of the most creative bands of the 1970s. They don't quite get their due, and partly is because they didn't really have a frontman and a stage persona. They were, even though they played live, especially later on, they were really a studio entity, and it was kind of accidentally they turned into it. They didn't have all the pressures of the record labels initially, of churning out hits. They were a collective of two groups of songwriters. Every person in this band had a perfect voice. That's really rare. And it's probably one of the only British bands that had a number one single of three of the vocalists. Maybe the Beatles. Did they have number one? Did George Harrison have a number one single with the Beatles? You know, did he? But three different singers, number one. No other British band ever had that, as far as I know, at least up to a point while they were around. And again, this is their second album, 10cc. But I'm going to go back a little bit. So I am doing a little bit of a historic, just a teaser. So please seek out this band. One of my favorite bands. They kind of fell out of fashion because later, obviously in the 70s, punk came about, and that's slickness. Now, they're not a prog band. They're maybe art rock. They're slick. They're poppy. They have great hooks. They're crafts people and artists. And again, these two different segments. But let's go back. Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders. Let's talk about that band first, because Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders came out just the second leg of the British invasion, had a big hit in America and in the UK. And Wayne Fontana one day gets up and says, I'm leaving the band, and left the Mindbenders, the rest of the band. And they regroup and have their biggest hit after, sung by Eric Stewart here. And that is A Groovy Kind of Love. Number one in America, number one in the UK, massive hit. And that was it for them. Eric Stewart wanted to record records, make records, be a producer, be an engineer. And him, together with some art school duo of Lal Karim and Kevin Godley, built a studio in Stockport outside of Manchester called Strawberry Studios. And their whole thing was being, in a way, the house band, playing in the studio, making records for anybody who would pay them. They did a lot of football theme records, songs for Manchester, for Liverpool, for other football teams. And they backed some other artists, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But parallel to all this was Graham Gouldman, who was in a band in Manchester called the Mockingbirds. Manchester had a pretty wonderful music scene and club scene in the mid-60s, you know, like Liverpool and obviously London, but these northern cities had, you know, really strong scenes, Birmingham as well. So Graham Gouldman is in a band called the Mockingbirds and writes this fantastic song that his publisher and label didn't want them to record, and they gave it to the Yardbirds, and that was For Your Love. Massive hit. He also gave them Heart Full of Soul. He wrote songs like No Milk Today for Herman's Hermits. He wrote Bus Stop for the Hollies, and Herman's Hermits also covered that. Listen People for Herman's Hermits. A slew of pop hits that were huge in America and the UK in the 1960s. When you're talking about 10cc, you really have to talk about Strawberry Studios, because that, in essence, is the extra thing that made this work. They were just playing around the studio all the time. They had their own studio so they could record, test the gear, test sounds, harmonies. They also were playing around in the studio, testing the drum sound, testing the drums and the recording gear, and they made this great single just out of the blue, accidentally. Kevin Godley was playing the drums. and kept going on the drums, and they did this little kind of children's riff with Lal Cream and then, of course, Eric Stewart. And it became the song Neanderthal Man. And they put it out under the name Hot Legs. That was the name of the trio at the time. This is an original Capitol issue of it. If you think this cover looks familiar, this is 1970. 2 years later, Alice Cooper would sort of duplicate this, lift it, influenced by the creative directors, whoever did that cover for Warner Brothers Records. Very, very similar to it. It's an old school desk, I mean, but still, it's no panties in this version. But that was an amazing song, and it was a really interesting song, kind of a novelty in a way, but just a wonderfully recorded song, and it put Strawberry Studios on the map to a point. And then Graham Gouldman jumps in at Strawberry Studios, and a partnership begins, the four of them. You have Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman as one half of the team, and you have Lal Cream and Kevin Godley as the other half. Two distinct, very creative songwriters. The Eric Stewart, Gouldman were the poppy, hook-based songwriters. Lal Cream and Kevin Godley, the art school creators. And the two of them, the two groups together, made these amazing songs. And they would bring these ideas to the studio and come up with things. Four great singers. So they would back up artists that would come, guest artists that would come and produce them and back them up. And I think one of the most important artists for them that really kind of kicked them in the asses a little bit was Neil Sedaka. And he came in, he was formerly a doo-wop singer in the 50s, had a lot of hits for other artists and himself in the early 60s, was pretty much by this point not happening. His sound wasn't happening. He was recording some things in England, and someone suggested he work with these guys up in Stockport, outside of Manchester. And he worked with the members of that would be 10cc on some recordings, on a couple of albums. This is what turned up in America. It really changed things for Neil Sedaka. And eventually, obviously, 10cc in a way during the recording of this. Now, this is on Rocket Record Company, Elton John's label. This is his comeback record. This was a massive hit. 1974, Neil Sedaka's back. Half this record was recorded with 10cc. They weren't called 10cc yet. Backing up Neil Sedaka, producing Neil Sedaka at Strawberry Studios. The other half of these was recorded in LA with some of the greatest studio musicians of the day in the 70s, of Chuck Finley, Russ Kunkel, Dean Parks, Milk Holland, Leland Sklar. And this is a really great record. And it all fits together. Of course, the one song that was one of the biggest hits, Laughter in the Rain, was not 10cc backing them. But Standing on the Inside, they do a version. This is the version of Love Will Keep Us Together. That became a huge hit later for Captain and Tennille. But this is the version with the members of what would become 10cc backing them up. And it was Neil Sedaka who said, you guys have the studio. You're here. You really need to do some stuff on your own. And of course, they did. They got in the studio. And eventually, this song came out. The first hit was Donna on here. It was going to be Waterfalls. But again, during this time, the two different songwriting teams would write things and come together. And they would literally, when they had a song, one team would add to the other team to make it the better song. Lal Cream and Kevin Godley were the more arty, experimental part of it. Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman were probably the better, not better, but they had the hooks and the songwriting thing. And the two of them together really made some amazing records. Now, Oh Donna might be considered kind of a cliche retro song, kind of a fluke one-hit wonder. It was going to be Waterfalls, but they got back, and that was the hit. After that, they had a bigger hit with Rubber Bullets. I believe Rubber Bullets went to #1. Again, a retro type of Beach Boys pop song, very kind of a California style, and that was on this label, Jonathan King's record label, UK Records out of London. A huge hit, did okay in America, but was massive in the UK. And then in 1974, their second album, 10cc, Sheet Music. The Worst Band in the World is on this record. Not even the biggest song on the album. I'd say the song that really hit it for them was the opening track, Wall Street Shuffle. Their songs are gimmicky. Their songs, they have a sense of humor in their songs. They're not normal. They're not what was really happening at the time. In a way, they're a mix of glam rock, art rock. If I say progressive, someone's going to take that out of context and say they're not progressive, but they're very progressive. Not prog in the world of Yes and King Crimson at all. They're great songwriters, very influenced by groups, obviously the Beatles. But the key to 10cc is what great songwriters they are and what they did in the studio. They played in the studio. They didn't have someone breathing over their shoulder time-wise for anything. They could work on these songs. They were a collective, a democracy, where all four members would add and subtract and work on the songs till they felt it was right. Again, the vocalist, depending on the best person for the job, they would write these songs, and no matter who wrote them, the best person for the job would sing it. They'd literally have auditions doing the song for the lead vocal, and whoever was the best person for that song would be it. And they all had these beautiful, angelic voices. I mean, Eric Stewart and Lal Cream has these kind of high voices. Kevin Godley could go high or he can go baritone. He could go low. Just an amazing band. Graham Gouldman, probably the more tenor. And of course, he had the experience of those great song hooks at the time. I'm not going to go through their entire catalog, but I can't continue without talking about this record. Because of royalty situations and bad royalties, they left UK and they did a bidding war, and all these record companies went after them. And there's a story that you should seek out in other places where they're about to sign. They all agreed to go with Virgin Records, Richard Branson's label. That was a really cool label at the time. And they left, and the manager got a better offer and signed them with Polygram Mercury Records in America here, which was a big disappointment for them initially, which is unfortunate because I think that would have been creatively the better record. But they still did what they want. They had time in the studio. They didn't have someone breathing over their shoulders, and they did this magnificent album, original soundtrack. Now, all these albums in the 70s, the cover design, Hypnosis did the cover design, beautiful cover art. Obviously, if you haven't seen the Hypnosis documentary, I think it's on Netflix, the albums he did for Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and Paul McCartney and Wings and countless other bands. They did all the albums throughout the 70s for 10cc as well. But this album changed everything. Of course, it's got the prog-like sweet song of One Night in Paris, Part 1 and Part 2 and Part 3, which is the beautiful, sweet. Life is a Minestrone, I think, was the first single on here, which is, again, they have this kitschy lyric thing. They have a sense of humor in their lyrics that a lot of other bands didn't have at the time. They did things for themselves, and if they became a hit, great. Of course, they wanted to have hits, but the one song on here that everyone knows, some people are tired of, but I think it's one of the best records of the 1970s, is I'm Not in Love. Originally written by Eric Stewart as a ballad, and then you were going to do a little Brazilian samba with it. And I think it was Kevin Godley who had the idea, let's do it a cappella. Let's just use all the instruments. Instead of instruments, let's use our vocals. And they literally did multi-tracks on multi-tracks, bringing them down to other tracks and building on this 600 layers of vocal backgrounds. And they all worked with the faders of the background vocals on this. And then, for that little artsy Kevin Godley, Lal Cream part, they brought in their receptionist to whisper the words, "Big boys don't cry, big boys don't cry." Became a massive hit. Now, this is the same time, coincidentally, a Bohemian Rhapsody with the multi-level vocals. And people to this day can compare the two. They're nothing alike, but they're so much alike. This is before we had all this digital work and everything had to be bounced down to different tracks, and like the Beatles did on a 4-track and Sgt. Pepper and in Tomorrow Never Knows, those kind of things, very influential. But this had never been done, and this is a dramatic track. There's a whole hour documentary on YouTube of that one song. Seek it out. It's amazing. Massive hit, I'm Not in Love. Great album. They would continue on to do other albums and have other hits. But they didn't have the frontmen like Freddie Mercury and the stage presence of Queen. Again, musically, they're really nothing like Queen, but in terms of the vocal harmonies, I would say this is one of the best vocal bands ever. Every musician, every vocalist is great. Even the Beatles, who had the great vocal, they had 2 amazing vocalists, with George Harrison, a really good vocalist, and then of course Ringo, who did his job really well. But 10cc had 4 vocalists. Any one of them was a lead singer. As 10cc continued, they experimented on songs, on projects in the studio, on sounds, and Kevin Godley and Al Cream were also kind of, the art school types were creating things, and they created this thing that they call the Gizmo. And it's an attachment you put on a guitar. They had it on a Stratocaster. You can see countless videos of it, that you could push and play and make your guitar sound like a string section, because they wanted to do these performances with strings where they really didn't have the budgets to afford a string section, a mini orchestra to work on records. So they invented this Gizmo, and they started out doing a demonstration record, in essence, of the Gizmo, and they were going to bring it to market eventually. And that took up a lot of their time. And in the days in the 1970s, it wasn't a time where artists or a segment or a solo artist, as much as it is today, could leave a band for 6 months, a year, work on a project and come back. Yes, there were solo albums in the 70s of Bill Wyman and Mick Jagger and Beatles in the very end of their career. But it wasn't a common thing yet. You had to kind of churn out records. And so during the time of working on the next album, Lal Cream and Kevin Godley were working with the Gizmo, and they came up with Consequences. Now, this is an album that on one level, it's a disaster. And one level, it's overambitious, progressive, prog, ambient, artistic, but it's a mess. Now, this is a 3-record set that Polygram put out, and this was a massive failure. 3-record set. Now, there's some things on this are brilliant. The first record is really supposed to be the demonstration record of the Gizmo, and it's a very ambient, artsy record. Today, I totally get it, and I totally love it. But then it goes into this storyline, this conceptual thing, written partially by Peter Cook, of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And in a way, it's this hybrid of experimental sounds and ambient progressive sounds with Goon Show and Monty Python sketches. And that's where the failure comes in. Ambitious as hell, crazy as hell. 3-record set with a booklet. Can you imagine? I got a promo copy, I remember, and I kept playing it and thinking, oh, I love this. What the fuck is that about? It tells you the whole history of the studio and everything. Here is the Gizmo on a Strat. This is not a masterpiece. It's not a later discovered masterpiece. It's problematic. They wanted to get Ella Fitzgerald to sing on a song, and they couldn't get her. And the label Polygram was able to get them Sarah Vaughan. And Sarah Vaughan sings beautifully on one track. Now, I don't suggest you go out and buy this album, Consequences. Someone out there is going to say, oh, I love that record. There's an artiness to it, experimental. And, over the 40 years, 50 years, it's become this cult classic. In a way, yes. But I would suggest I think there were various versions that came out later, years later, broken up. But this is the promo record that Mercury Records in America, and I suppose there was a Polygram version maybe in the UK. This is the promo that went to radio stations, record store managers like me. This is Lal Creme, Kevin Godley, Consequences. Musical excerpts from. This is fantastic. This talks about each song. There are brilliant songs and sounds that sound like 10cc. So obviously sound like the Log Cream, Kevin Godley half of 10cc. Beautiful harmonies, beautiful guitar and electronic arrangements, and of course the Gizmo, that sound throughout it. Sparks of energy, sparks of harmonic explosions in a way, and then beautiful ballads. Of course, the song Lost Weekend, Kevin has this beautiful vocal thing, and the chorus, like the middle eight chorus part or the middle comes in with Sarah Vaughan, and it's just as beautiful. There's a song here, the prettiest track on Consequences is 5 o'clock in the morning, 4-minute track, and it goes through 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7. It could have been like the perfect 10cc song. And so it got lost here. This is a magnificent record. If this had a good cover, if this had been released at the time, maybe under Log Cream and Kevin Godley, or these songs with 10cc, these would have been magnificent. So in closing, 10cc continued on with Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman, had some very hit records. The only time I ever saw them was around, I think, 77, 78. They did a world tour, and they were great. They brought in this whole big band to back them up, but they did the hits. They were great. You can see videos on YouTube of them. There was a double live album on Mercury Records in the States, blue cover. They're in the back of their equipment van. It's actually a really good sounding record. I like their studio stuff. To me, they are one of the best studio bands ever. Lol Cream and Kevin Godley went on, and after the failure of Consequences, retreated and started doing experiments. But the thing about them is in the 1980s, they became one of the most creative, in-demand video directing teams of the MTV years. Rocket, Herbie Hancock, Every Breath You Take by the Police, and of course their own song they did in 1985 called Cry. And this was done before digital work. If you remember, this was all these faces they cast singing the songs, dissolving in all these different ethnic groups, age groups, and it's a beautiful ballad called Cry. And then in 1985, Godley and Cream put this record out, and this is called the History Mix Volume 1. I don't believe there was ever a Volume 2. This is a kind of a cool overview. This fits right into the mid-80s sound of everything, because side 1 are songs from 10cc, from Lol Creme and Kevin Godley, remixed by Art of Noise, and has that Art of Noise sound. If you know the records of Art of Noise, you know there's that kind of mixed thing happening, and they slow it down, they speed it up, they put a beat, and they have Rubber Bullets, Minestrone, I'm Not Loving, of course, Cry. You have the single version of Cry on side 2, and An Englishman in New York, Save Mountain for Me, and Golden Boy, which is a beautiful coda. But again, they had a successful independent career as video directors. They really decided they weren't musicians anymore, but they were into the scene with musicians, and had that incredible successful run as a director in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, if you want an overview of pretty much whatever I said, and you're a compact disc person, this is probably the way to go. I prefer all the full albums, but this is a great overview. This is a 4-disc set, before, during, and after. Disc 1 are all the hits from 1972 to 1978, all those hits. Some I mentioned, plenty more I didn't. Disc 2, after, the post years with Godley and Cream, with each of them doing projects they worked on. There's a song, Pretty Little Head. Remember, for a little while in the early 80s, Eric Stewart hooks up with Paul McCartney and plays on a couple of his solo records then. So that's on here. You got the Art of Noise mix on here of some things. Just a really great disc of a mix of music. Disc 3 are things they worked on before, solo before. Graham Gouldman worked on some bubblegum music, so things that are on here. Some of the football songs are on here. So you can have a deep dive in things that may or may not interest you, but it's kind of fun to see that. And Disc 4 has the early years. You have Groovy Kind of Love by the Mindbenders. You have Graham Gouldman covering the songs he wrote. Unfortunately, they don't have the original versions of For Your Love by the Yardbirds or Herman's Hermits or the Hollies here. You have Hot Legs, Neanderthal Man, and so you have that early stuff. You have Love Will Keep Us Together by Neil Sedaka. So this really tells the full story. Now, again, I prefer the proper albums, but this is a cool mix anyway. So thanks for watching. 10cc, the worst band in the world. Mazzy loves you.